Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, which is coming right up. But first, a few thoughts of my own. I keep reading about smart cars, driverless cars, computer-controlled cars, cars that have artificial intelligence, which led me to wonder, will they have the same personalities as today's cars or the drivers of today's cars? Will the Mercedes be smarter than the little Kia I drive? Will it try to dodge it off the road, push it off the road the way Mercedes do to me now? Will big smart cars demand that they get the best parking spaces? What's it going to be like? Will there be a sense of inferiority, artificial intelligence inferiority bred into a Kia's soul, which is what I drive? I'm worried about this. I don't want cars that think and feel. It's bad enough the drivers who think and feel and believe that they can do what they like depending on the kind of car they drive. You know, just think about this. Will the Volvo be the polite car on the road? Think about it. We have an interesting show for you today, and it begins with the fact that this program has been on the air for 19 years. Linda Gasparello, sitting with me, the co-host, we've been at this for a long time, and we've been thinking about ways of changing it, not radically, but pumping it up, if you will. And along comes a very interesting proposal, and we're going to do this from two of my friends, people you've met on this program in the past. G. Wayne Miller, who is a writer, book author, and also a journalist with the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, and Jim Ludes, who is the director of the Pell Center, which is part of Salve, Regina University. And together they operate a thing called Story in the Public Square. And periodically, Story in the Public Square is going to do what I feared that Mercedes would do, push me out of the way and replace me and Linda, maybe 1 week a month, something like that. So here we all are. Jim, what is Story in the Public Square?
Well, I think I need to very clearly say we don't ever expect to replace you.
Supplement, I think is the right word.
If that, we would follow along in your wake perhaps, but we're just thrilled at the opportunity.
Right. Well, that's great. Tell me what is Story in the Public Square?
Well, Story in the Public Square is an effort that Wayne and I have been collaborating on now for 3-4 years.
Almost 4 years.
That it's an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. So we have had a research program at Salve, Regina University at the Pell Center. We give an annual Pell Center Prize for Story in the Public Square to storytellers who have had a big impact on public affairs. So the first year the winner was Dana Priest, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner from the Washington Post.
Yeah, I've met her.
Emmy-winning screenwriter Danny Strong. And last year we honored Lisa Genova, 4 New York Times bestsellers to her credit, including Still Anthony and, Still Alice and Love Anthony.
Right.
Where do you draw the line between journalism, what Wayne and I and Linda do and have done all of our adult lives, and stories? We tell stories, but they're supposed to be fact. Are these fictional stories?
They can be. Yeah.
Or these are stories related to fact?
It could be any of the above.
If they're fact, they're testimony, right?
Well, yeah, anything that sort of uses narrative which is character and emotion and the development of something happening is a story. And so journalism is certainly part of storytelling, but so is fiction and literature and film, even poetry or photography.
And even music too, of course, would be included in our definition of story.
This is how the story affects society?
Yeah.
Society and also the individual, but you know, a very moving public kind of story that we celebrate and like to tell causes people to think on perhaps a deeper level than just seeing, you know, the latest headlines. It may motivate them to change their philosophy. It may motivate them to try to push for social change or public policy change. It connects on an emotional level. And the word emotion here, I think, is really good. And so it somehow activates or inspires or causes a reaction in people that's different than, you know, sort of your ordinary headlines, and not that there's anything wrong with those, being in the business.
But it certainly can encompass journalism.
Yes.
The very first Pell Center Prize winner for Story in the Public Square was Dana Priest, as I mentioned. And in particular, we were mindful of some of the reporting that she had done several years ago now at this point, that changed the way America treats its veterans, particularly at Walter Reed Hospital.
That was extraordinarily
It was.
important. And big newspapers, like the Washington Post, where she works, are able to do that because they have the resources.
Right.
Harder, I suspect, for your newspaper, with one assumes less in the way of resources.
Yeah, it is a little bit more difficult, but we still take the time and find the resources to do that kind of storytelling. And I'm one of several people who does that at the Providence Journal. I want to make a note about the Dana Priest stories about Walter Reed and veterans. One of the reasons, there was plenty of fact in her stories, which she co-wrote, but there was also emotion. She told the personal stories of veterans, and it was getting inside their heads, inside their worlds, seeing them up close and personal, reading about them, seeing the photography. That was the essential component, in my view, that caused such a reaction. I mean, it led to a change in how we treated veterans at that medical
People
center.
lost their jobs.
People lost their
There's
jobs.
Real specific impact that followed.
Well, you do, look at the way stories, a single story or a book can really move society and politics. And this is a part of the American tradition. I mean, maybe starting off with Thomas Paine and Common Sense, who railed against, in 1776, he railed against the monarchy. Or you had Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Exactly.
Or you had the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass that, showed you a personal story of an articulate slave who all of a sudden was a person in the eyes of those who would dehumanize black men and women in the United States.
It was humanizing, it was persuasive. In the case of Uncle Tom's Cabin, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you wrote that little book that caused this great war."
Yes,
so
exactly.
it is in a lot of respects the classic example, but it was part of the time in which it was written, but it was also the content and the power of the story that she told.
I want to get to somebody else who told stories, but in journalism, which was Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle was in the Second World War. He was the first reporter who told this war from the GI's point of view, actually got into the foxholes. Extraordinary that it wasn't being done to that point in time. Yeah. He wrote for Scripps Howard, by the way, a chain of newspapers, and an extraordinary change in the way we covered wars. Reporters saw a new dimension, something else they could do.
And if you look at today's correspondents and journalists who are writing about wars, Chris Chivers, C.J. Chivers from the New York Times, who happens to live in Rhode Island and worked for a while at the Providence Journal, he tells the same kind of story. He brings you into the battle zone. He brings you into the unit. He brings you into the people in the village that are affected in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. And again, it's that person. You feel like you know that person after reading one of his stories, and you can relate. There's empathy. There's empathy there.
Absolutely.
That you may not get. You can see X number of people were killed in this battle, and that will move you.
Right.
And that means something, and you need that information. But if you focus on one person who died or someone who lost a child or whatever, that connects on a deeper level somewhere in the brain.
Novelists know that.
Of course,
knew
of
that.
course.
But I want to bring up, because I think you'll find it interesting, and I hope our viewers do, and that is something that happened in South Africa during the struggle against apartheid. There was a magazine which actually had circulation all over the African continent called Drum. Just drum, like a drum, D-R-U-M. And they had this incredible way of dealing with hostile situations in which the reporter wrote in the third person. And Mr. Drum went to Cape Town to see the Prime Minister. Mr. Drum was thrown out of the Prime Minister's office by a sergeant, And throughout the life of this magazine, there was this third person, Mr. Drum. Mr. Drum went here. Mr. Drum was arrested. Mr. Drum was in court. It also worked because other Mr. Drums, as people were jailed and suffered the privations which went with the opposition to apartheid, but it's also brilliant journalism. It enabled the reporter to Mr. Drum looked down and saw that they were eating lobster. He was very hungry, but he couldn't get any for himself. This is both very funny, very personal, and spoke to the African audience and was terribly important. And I'm sad to say that nobody in the establishment of journalism seems to give due credit to Drum magazine and Mr. Drum. I was lucky that I was living in the next country up, then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and I knew all about Drum. I was actually nearly went to work for it at one time. But I thought journalistically it was brilliant. And that was another way of telling the story. And you could basically, as one person fell, another could step in and say, I am Mr. Drum. I thought it was absolutely extraordinary. And I wish we'd seen more of it and that it was more celebrated.
Well, you know, you really do look at some of the issues that authors have decided to focus on. The Jungle of Upton Sinclair. I mean, it focused not only on the meatpacking industry, which absolutely needed reform, but on the plight of immigrants and low-wage workers in cities. And it did so much to change laws in this country. We've got those things happening this day and age, things that storytellers are telling these stories about and hopefully they'll be able to change things through those stories.
One of the people that we've worked with last summer was New York Times columnist, journalist Dan Barry, who has sort of a remarkably varied tapestry of reporting that he's done over the years. And one of the series that he wrote for the New York Times was called
Boys in the Bunkhouse.
And but the longer series was This Town. It profiled one specific the small town America and what's been this land. Thank you.
Right.
This land.
And it's a wonderful series that tells exactly those kinds of stories and sort of shows what's happening in small town America, the economic dislocations that are taking place, the challenges facing everybody from immigrant families to single mothers to middle class families whose wages aren't going as far as they once were. So it is. It's a tradition in American politics, as you pointed out, and in American culture, that these stories move us.
And the way Dan works, Dan will go to a place and for several days or a week or whatever, almost move in with these people. So he gets to see daily events. He gets to get a feel for the people. And again, you complement that with the appropriate data and numbers, and you come up with the Dan Barry kind of story. He has a new book coming out soon, too, by the way. So
You just plugged it.
Boys in the Bunkhouse. So we're looking forward to that. He's one of the great storytellers of our time.
I think too about, I always mispronounce her name, Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote about living on the minimum wage. Most compelling story about trying to do that.
Absolutely. I've got to tell a little story about the minimum wage I was getting from some political outfit or some so-called public affairs group, which is really opposed to the minimum wage rising, devoutly opposed. So I wrote to them nicely, I'm a journalist, that said, could you tell me, give me some examples of people living in your office living on the minimum wage? I haven't heard a word from them, and they stopped sending their propaganda to me. We're going to take a little break here for station identification, primarily for our listeners on Sirius XM radio, where the audio from this program plays 4 times on the weekends. You are listening to White House Chronicle with myself, Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello of this program, and now the cat is out of the bag. You know she's been with the program since its inception 19 years ago.
19 years ago.
And another child, G. Wayne Miller, who's a very distinguished writer with the Providence Journal and who is also a novelist, not a novelist, you are a novelist too, but also written some very compelling factual books, one of which we featured on this program very successfully about the inception of the car industry. Car Crazy. If you haven't read it, it's a great read. Get it.
Thank you. Appreciate
and
that.
from the Pell Center, which is part of Salve, Regina University, Jim Ludes. And I think you should tell people in a moment when I finish with this identification, which I should also say this program is seen on 200 American television stations and around the world on the English language broadcast television and radio of the Voice of America. Back to Jim Ludes. Jim Ludes, where did this title come from? This stories in the public square. The stories bit we get, the public square we need to know about.
Well, it really goes back to a coffee shop in Newport in 2012. Where
4 years ago, 4 years ago this month.
Wayne and I had sat down and we're looking for something to do together. And Wayne, as you mentioned, is a...
Did you think of like having a drink? That's something people do together.
Well, we were having coffee. There was
drink was
coffee.
coffee.
Yeah, there was warm beverage involved. But we, Wayne is a very gifted and accomplished storyteller. And he had an idea of doing something, and I should note also is the biographer of the Pell Center's namesake, Senator Claiborne Pell. And so we had met in the context of the launch of that book, and we had said, let's do something. Wayne was interested to do something around storytelling. As the head of a think tank that is interested in broad public policy issues, I was looking for something that had more of a contemporary political flair to it. And what we wound up was in a conversation talking about these stories, these narratives that have had big, broad public impact. And so because we didn't have a very good editor, we wound up with a 4-word title to this project, which is Story in the Public Square, which I guess is 5 words. But
Our Twitter handle, by the way, is Pub Story. Maybe you like that better.
I'm without an opinion. I think you should tell people about Salve Regina, because of all the universities in America, it has the most unique campus. It is among the mansions called cottages. The mansions that the rich had in Newport.
In the Gilded Age.
They were called cottages, and there's still some of them are wonderful to visit, and you can hear concerts there. Others were bought by the university, progressively bought as they fell into disuse, and now it is the most extraordinary university in that it has these. The set is so great.
It is one of the most beautiful places on earth. And Salve Regina University is a comprehensive university. We've got about 2,000 undergraduate students, about another 500 to 700 graduate students in a broad array of majors. But from the helping services to the sciences and the humanities. It's run by the Sisters of Mercy. It's a Catholic university, and it's where I've been for 4 years. The Pell Center is only about 20 years old. In fact, the 20th anniversary is next year. But the synergy between Claiborne Pell, who used to talk about politics, was about ideas, putting ideas into action to help people.
Yeah, when he was in the Senate. Yeah. Linda, I wanted to ask you, Lawrence of Arabia. Everybody, a lot of people have heard of Lawrence of Arabia, but that's because one man told his story, right?
Yes, that's right. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune actually went to Arabia to tell the story, and not only tell the story, but after he told it, managed to kind of circus act about Lawrence of Arabia, including appearances, recreations. It was really something. I mean, it was a very compelling story, which Lawrence, of course, had a huge ego and wanted to tell. And it was told quite brilliantly by the American press, by him.
Which is interesting, as he was an Englishman and was very much an English theater of war where he operated. Any other stories? Any other great stories? What stories have affected your life?
Well, I think that some of the books, obviously, that you've read. I think until I read Silent Spring, I don't think that I was terribly aware of the environment and aware of the destruction that
As viewers of this program know, the oceans are the new silent area. They're dying very quickly, and that story needs to be told maybe by a novelist. I often think that so many of our problems need a novelist, need a story. There's the privations of the underclass. In Boston, we had a very interesting thing recently where the newspaper distributors, they changed companies. The Boston Globe newspaper changed companies. Another company couldn't distribute, but what really happened, the story was that the reporters on the Boston Globe discovered how awful the condition of people who deliver newspapers is. They're poorly paid, it's dreadful work, bad hours, and the papers treat them as independent contractors, a bit like Uber drivers, but even more so. And it's a really bad situation. We keep running into this where suddenly the underclass is revealed and then somehow the cover comes back on. We saw this during Katrina. We realized what huge poverty there was in Louisiana. Now the cover is back on. We need novelists in there. We need the equivalent of Charles Dickens to tell these stories.
And we need a presidential election cycle where people are talking about these kinds of issues as well.
Well, here's
and that's not happening in
a
this
good
cycle
example
as much as it
of the
should.
presidential election cycle. In a previous presidential election cycle, when Jim Webb was running for president from the state of Virginia, he spoke very passionately about Appalachia. I wrote an article at the time about Appalachia that all of a sudden, like Brigadoon, appears and then disappears again until another election cycle. You know, what happens to those people, those promises, those, you know, those impassioned speeches that are made? What happens to these people? Once again, they get shunted aside. And it's a real tragedy. This happens over and over again in many communities in the United States. Appalachia is one of the, you know, the ones that I think is the poster child for people being pushed aside after an election cycle. And it's a tragedy.
One of the background issues here is the culture today. We live in a culture where Hollywood celebrities and where reality TV shows and where what is on the internet and what is on Instagram and Snapchat, it's a very different culture. It doesn't value, it doesn't really pay attention to what you're talking about. How we would change that is a whole separate discussion.
I think I'm glad you raised that, Wayne, because there's something else. There's a poisonous mythology that people who don't have enough of anything are in that predicament because they failed in some way.
They caused it themselves. Exactly.
That's right,
yes.
and that is a poisonous, treacherous, evil mythology, which is
absolutely agree.
Which is much around at the moment.
But it's an American impulse. We've done that over and over and over again in our history to sort of blame the people who are really blameless.
But the reality is that American politicians everywhere, love stories because they do convey emotion, they do inspire action, so they can very effectively be used to mobilize people to go to caucus in Iowa, to go to vote in primaries, and so this is stuff. But the stories that we're hearing this year, in the Democratic Party, the story that we're principally hearing is about inequality. Right, about economic inequality. That's the story that Bernie Sanders focused on. He could have focused on other issues, but that's the story that he's focused on. He's found great energy by focusing on that story. On the right, any number of candidates have focused on sort of scary stories, right? Scary stories about terrorists and immigrants and the need to protect ourselves because the boogeyman is out there. These are all stories. And one of the things that has animated us from the beginning is to make sure that if we do anything else in this project, is that we help the public understand that we're all being told stories.
And one of the things we're toying with doing, we do a number of events and seminars and programs, and we've been talking about this. The title would be Lies Are Stories Too. Yeah. A story does not have to be true. A story can be quite false. A story is something people hear, they then tell someone else and they believe. So, to your point, exactly.
At lies which won't die.
Yeah.
The lies that have been propagated throughout history against the Jews.
Yeah.
They won't die. They keep cropping up. The same lie.
True.
The Protocols of Zion, for example. But they're everywhere. The idea that the poor are lazy, or that they're this. The poor work much harder than the rich. Yeah. My father was poor. He worked a lot harder than I've ever worked, and I worked fairly hard, and much more demanding, difficult manual work that breaks the body while the mind is numbed while you're doing it. I heard on the radio the other day, and I thought, my God, if somebody could just write a Dickens-like novel about this woman talking about the minimum wage, and she cleans aeroplanes in New York, 20 aeroplanes a night,
She's Hispanic.
has 4 children, and said in a very articulate and appealing sort of way to a national public radio, I think, interviewer, I managed to get by, but I don't have anything left, not even candy for the babies.
Not even money for candy. I mean, when you think about it, not being able to buy just a
And
couple of
this
pieces
myth,
of candy
this
for your
myth
kids.
that people can live on the minimum wage
unbelievable.
as it is, they won't live much better if it goes up. And if it's going to cause tremendous inflation for it to go up, we need some other adjustments in society. So otherwise you're saying some must suffer, so the whole edifice keeps standing.
Well, the
that
whole
is
issue
not
of
acceptable.
inequality, and what we like about stories is that they open up conversations then about like this, that can really sort of get into sort of what are the nuts and bolts behind it. So just in the last couple of weeks, we heard that, you know, this new study of global inequality, and was it 83 families or 63 families have as much wealth as the bottom half of the global population.
An astounding.
That's an astounding piece of evidence that you probably might not remember, but you'll remember the story about the maintenance worker at Delta Airlines in New York City because it's human, and you remember her story and the fact that she couldn't buy candy for her children.
And these are the kinds of issues that Jim and I are going to get into when we do our rotation through White House Chronicle. We're going to bring on storytellers, prominent people, whether in journalism or in film or in music or in poetry or even in art or wherever it might be, prominent storytellers who are going to help us discuss and celebrate
And I
what we're
hope
talking about here now.
successes. We need successes
Absolutely.
in life. We need to see people who climb out of the poverty, out of whatever entrapment they've been.
And there are plenty of those stories to be
shackled
told.
in.
We don't celebrate them the way we perhaps should.
Yeah, well, this is very interesting, gentlemen. I wish you good luck. Linda, what do you think?
Thank you.
Oh, I think it's just going to be a great
Do you
party.
think they can be as good as us? The
Can I
answer
come
is
back
no.
next week if I say yes?
We'll let the audience be the judge of that. How
I
about
have
that?
to tread very carefully here.
Yeah, you really have to.
I think this is very exciting. My mind
you.
is now sort of jumping
we-
around with stories that have influenced my
Impact,
life, whether it
yes.
was stories that came out of British history, which was, you know, pretty doctored, but certainly stayed with you, or the stories I think should be told.
Well, we're
The
delighted at this
stories about the
opportunity.
old people who are shut-ins. I've just written a column about shut-ins and meals on wheels because I feel so badly. These are people who worked all their lives, gave to society, did the right things, and now they're shut in and starving, and it's appalling. And their story needs to be told. Good luck to you, gentlemen.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Linda,
Thank you.
enjoy our little time off. Cheers. We will be back next week. Cheers.